going to begin with step one of our reverse portrait painting. This is something that can typically be done on glass or even plexiglass. Today we're just using a simple overhead transparency sheet. It's a nice way to practice. If you have an old frame or something, you could use the same thing to paint on the glass, just knowing that it'd be a little more slippery. We are using regular acrylic paint, a little bit medium to heavy bodied acrylic paint's the best. We're going to start with white, and we're going to do the highlights, like the whites of the eyes, any highlights in the hair, those types of things first, because when you paint in reverse you need to work with your details because we're layering backwards, and then when we flip it over we'll have our completed piece. So I'm going to start my little detail brush here, put just a small amount of paint on the brush because big globs will just create problems. And I'm starting to look here at my picture of Abraham Lincoln and looking at where the whites of his eyes are showing. And you want to make sure that this part, since it's got to be a bright white, is painted with a good thick layer, not too thin. If you have a thin layer, other colors will show through it later. So it just depends on how heavy-bodied your paint is. If you're using the craft type paint that comes in the little bottles from the craft section, quite often that is much thinner, closer to a watery consistency, and it will work, but might take another layer after the first one dries. And I'm very gently putting this on here, and I notice there's a little sparkle in the eye right there from reflected light, and there's a little bit here, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in. That adds to our final picture. There's not a lot of highlight in this one. I'm going to do a little bit in his beard, and I like to follow the direction of the hair growth because if it's more believable if you're doing that. My brush needs a little more paint, so I'm going to go over here, and sometimes I dab it off on whatever I'm using as a palette to make sure I don't get too much, because if you get globs then you get big long streaks of paint that you don't really want. Okay, so we just make a few of those. Trying to see, it looks like there's some up in his hair up here. So we'll come in and just a few. It helps to break up the texture, and this is where if it's a little bit lighter covering of paint, you're okay. And obviously I'm doing this a little bit quick. You can make your lines a little more detailed. The brush I have today it's a little bit older and it's not keeping its shape as well as I'd like, but it's doing okay. Alright, so this white is just a little bit thinner application, but it's enough that it's going to give me that texture, and it's following the growth of the hair, the direction, I should say, of how it's laid out here. Alright, once you've gone through and you've kind of picked, I'm not going to worry about these whites right now, I'll do that later after I do some outlining, which is in step 2. Okay, just double check around the eyes, make sure I have everything that I needed there. So it all depends on the pose that you choose. This is fun to do with portraits, especially when you've chosen a little, sometimes a comical type pose or something that sends a message, so when people are looking at it they say, wonder what they were thinking. Or it actually tells a story. You can tell by maybe something, a prop or something you're holding in your hand, or in addition to the look on your face, it tells a story. Alright, so pretty much my highlights are done. So I'm going to rinse out my brush. I like to keep water handy so I can keep my brush clean. Acrylic paints dry very fast, and they can ruin a brush if you don't keep your brush maintained. So I like to keep my paper towel nearby and make sure it's clean. So if you're taking a break at any point, you want to make sure you clean out your brush. Moving on to step 2, I've chosen the pure solid color that I'm going to use for my monochromatic painting. And in this case it's going to be blue. I've already done my highlights, areas I wanted to be in white and to be a little shinier. So I'm going to use this as outline. one of the things I want to do is take care of the pupil of the eye as well. The pupil is the dark part of your eye that expands and contracts based on how much light is shining in. So I'm going to do that. It doesn't cover the whole eye. And you're going to go over a little bit of your white, sparkly part of your eye there where the light was reflecting. Don't worry, because it will still show on the other side of your painting, because remember, we're painting in reverse. Alright, and try not to get your pupils too small, because if they're too small, then it looks like somebody's scared or angry. Larger pupils actually seem a little more calm. And let's see, here we go. So now this is a part where you have to outline the eyelid itself. Don't outline the eye socket. And if you get too much detail around the eyes, it can make something, like, can look kind of weird. We're trying to simplify this down a bit. And I have to keep going back and getting paint, but I keep trying to keep the brush from picking up too much. Paint's not cooperating as much as I'd like. Alright, and then I'm going to outline the upper eyelid. Okay, and I'm still leaving that area where the iris is going to be. That's the colored portion of your eye. Because later, we're in step 3, we'll start making some tints of our first color for a monochromatic portrait. Okay, since I chose blue, my tints will be based on blue. Alright, I just keep working on that. I don't always, it depends on the size and how much you've zoomed in on a picture. If you include eyelashes and things, sometimes I don't include them when I'm doing this part, because they might not look natural. So we're just trying to get a basic image of the person that we're painting. Okay, if I lift that up, we might be able to see a little bit of what I've done so far. So you can see the paint is starting to stick quite well. And then we're going to do things like the lips. You'll outline, I think I'm going to go up to the hair first, because this is a common mistake where sometimes, especially if I'm working with kids, they will outline this as one big egg shape and leave it, and then paint their hair, and then you've got this separation between the two. Actually, what you should do is follow the growth of the hair and let the hair define the outline, and it all depends on the quality of your paint and how well it's sticking and moving in the brush to how detailed your hair will actually look. But I'm following that and allowing this to outline where the head is, because that's naturally how our faces are outlined. It's by our hair, if we have hair. Some people shave their hair off or are naturally balding, and so then you wouldn't have that, but it's still defined based on what's around it rather than just drawing a line. And you can fill in the rest of the hair as you go, but I like to kind of get around the edge of the the face first, just to help define it. And then I'll get it back in here and paint the hair out. In this picture, because it's so old, it's kind of blurry around the edges, so you have to do the best you can. And when I print these pictures, because I didn't mention this before, everything's in reverse, so I actually flipped the picture. Once I put it into my computer, I flipped it so it's in reverse, so that, especially if you're wearing printed t-shirts or anything and you're planning to paint those, it makes it very easy, because then when you flip it around, everything comes back to the normal view again, and you're able to have your monochromatic portrait without everything being backwards. Okay, now his ear, I'm going to outline the ear with my paint, and I'm finding this paint is just not cooperating as much, so I have to go back and put some more on my brush a little more often. That's okay, I'd rather put a little on at a time than have big globs. And if you do get a glob of paint, it's not the end of the world. Okay, and I'm trying to see kind of where those shadows are, where the ear the ear has these really cool shapes in it, so you want to make sure you include them. And I know this, like I said, this is a little blurry, so I can't tell exactly where those shapes are. So I'm putting them in the best I can. But it seems to be working. So I lift that up, you can start to see the image is appearing. Alright, and we'll keep going at it. He's got a beard we have to deal with. So that's a lot of hair to paint in place and help define the face. And it's actually up along his ears. Okay, so or maybe it's just dark shadow. It's hard to tell because, like I said, the side of this picture is so blurry. It's probably dark shadow. That's one of the neat things too, is you look at the quality of photography and how it has changed, the ability to create an image and all the things that have happened in our world and how we've changed, improved. You know, photography was a big thing when it came out and they were printing the materials they had then. It was the greatest thing they had. They were able to create an image of someone. And then over time we started to get to color pictures, and that began to develop and into more and more quality of color even, because if you look at pictures when they first started using color and the type of color we have, the vivid colors we have now, it's amazing. And now we even have, with the dawn of digital photography, we don't even have to have film anymore, so some of you have never even had to deal with film, which is a nice thing because now we can see our pictures instantly and decide which ones are good, and if we need to take another one we can do it right then on the spot, not have to wait until someone develops it and gets it back to you and then find out, oh, that's not, none of them are usable. It happens sometimes. Alright, so we're working on this beard. Like I said, if you leave some of the areas where you'll notice the paint is thin and thick, that's okay, because if you start putting tints, such as your background tint later, it'll fill in those spots and actually give you some more texture. But I'm still trying to create the illusion of hair as I do this. Alright, now I'm kind of skipping around because I want to give you the idea of everything we're doing. So I'll come back and finish up the beard later. But here we have another ear, so I would outline that ear. And again, like I said, this picture, it's so old, it's blurry on the outside. The focus was kind of right here, and it blurred out before we could get all the details. So I'm just going to do the best I can with what I can see. Again, there's that hair defining the edge of the face, and you may have to now if you have a part in the hair like right here, make sure you follow that direction of where the hair is growing. And he's got some hair sticking out here. I had a haircut recently before this picture. Okay, but there it is. It's growing right into that part. And then when you start this section of hair, you start right from that same spot, and that part will appear in your final painting. So following the natural growth of the hair, or the natural styling of the hair, I should say. Alright, and again, I'm kind of skipping around to show the important parts. You would continue working on the hair here, and the beard as well. And be careful that this stuff is dry before you start reaching over or setting your hand here, because you could damage your work. But here we're going to do the eyebrows, and you should try to paint it in the same direction that the eyebrows grow as well. And he has very thick eyebrows, so the paint will be thicker, covering. And he's got very deep eyes, are set very deep, so there's a lot of shadow in there, so that could be a little tricky. I just chose this picture for example purposes because I thought it would be a good one. Alright, so we've got eyebrows painted in. I lift this up, you can see that a face is starting to appear. The other thing you do is work with the nose, and you don't need every detail of the nose. Look for those really strong shadows, and I might do a thin part there. And if you leave some spaces in between, that's okay. But quite often I don't do every detail in the nose. I just want the main parts that are showing, and then I might leave some space, because your brain, or the viewer's brain, will kind of fill in the rest and say, yep, that's a nose. Okay, if their nostrils are showing, then you would paint in the dark shadow where the nostrils are, just in the shape that you see. Sometimes you don't see a full circle or an oval, it's just the outer edge, so you need to consider that as you're painting. Let's see how we've done. Nose shape. Okay, we've got a nose defined. I've got this just taped at the top, hinged, so that it's not so easy for it to slide around, but that way it also gives me the chance to check my progress. And this is kind of shadowed here, so I'm going to put it in. If I don't like it, the cool thing about this paint is I can always go back and take this side of my brush and scratch some of it off, or clean up the edges, like right here on this ear. Maybe I didn't like that edge. I take the brush and kind of run it along there gradually until I touch it up and pull off that little bit of paint, and then you can always rub it off on your paper towel nearby. Alright, the other thing that you have to remember is around the lips. So here we go. You've got this bottom lip, the outer edge, because we're just doing outlining right now. So you catch that, however thick it may be, right up into here. And then we have the upper lip, and you follow the contours of that. Okay, and then here we go down this side. And I'm constantly refilling my brush with some paint so that I can... And I'm touching this very gently because I only want it to grab a little at a time. I don't want it to just suddenly have a blob. Okay, so I've got upper and lower outline of the lip. Now, if there's no, since he wasn't smiling, we just have to do the center where the lips come together. There's a nice dark line, a shadow that is created here where they come together. Okay. And that seems to be coming okay. Now again, like I said, if it's really, really light, you may want to go over it again, because if it looks transparent, that means the next color could show through, or the next layer, and lighten it too much. So it depends on how strong you want those lines. You have to consider what it is you're trying to show in that spot. Okay? So we've gone around those, and if you have some really strong lines, which he does here in his face, you would paint those in as well. Okay, and you can even paint this. You have to be careful when you put lines in, because you can create, if you put too many in when you're creating a piece of art, it can make somebody look old, much older than they are. If it's appropriate to put it there, then go for it. If you don't like it, you can always carefully scratch it back out. Okay, slipped a little here, so I'll take that end of my brush, clean that up. There we go, I like that now. Okay, and if you want to put a little bit of this shadow here. And I'm doing this very lightly. This is one of those spots where I want it to be shadowy, but I'm putting the paint so thin that I know I'm going to be able to see through it. I just want to see some of that, define some of that part of his face. Okay. And then there's this edge here that you want to get the edges of the face. So if there's no facial hair or anything to define it, then you actually would outline that a little bit. And then let the wherever his beard's showing. Like I said, this is not the... Alright, here we go. And you would keep going. So you'd also, since we're using blue, we would outline the clothing. So this edge of his clothes here, we would outline this. Not painting everything in yet, because we'll make tints. We're just creating outlines. Okay, and then I'll go here. Get some more paint, because I know it's getting a little thin on there. Alright, get some more. If you're painting on glass, it might take you a little longer to get the right amount of thickness, because glass might be a little more slippery than even this plastic. See, I'm outlining the edges of the shirt, collar here, and where the next one comes. Because later I will come back and I will paint, I may even paint that white. It just, since it is a white, or appears to be a white shirt. But you need to define all those edges. Okay, right here. It depends on the quality of your brush. Like I said, this brush is getting kind of worn out, so it's not giving me the clean edges that I want, but it's okay for what we're doing. I'm not worried about super crisp lines. Going back over some of those lines because I noticed they're kind of weak, where they're going to be transparent. Okay, and then you just keep doing that. Like so, these will, even though this is dark, I know that I'm going to be creating a different value for this bow tie. So I would trace the darkest lines around it to give it its shape and show how it's tied together and where its edges are. Okay. And this little line right here, because that helps to give you the feel of how the cloth is affected by being tied. Edges, defining all those shapes. That's what this step is about. Getting everything there, because we're building up from detail to less detailed as we move on. Okay, you might put a little line in here showing an indentation. Okay, if you want some there, you can. Alright, looks pretty good, and of course I would keep outlining, so like this edge. Okay. Once everything's outlined, hair's filled in, then we would go on to step 3. Alright, everything is dry from steps 1 and 2. We've done all of our outlining and filling in the hair, and using our color, gone through and did the clothing that's visible. Okay, now we need to make a tint. And we're going to try to make this be the least of the tints, meaning that it's not a lot of white in this one yet. Because we're going to do the lips, and we're going to do the iris of the eye. And anything that's dry now can actually be painted over, and it will not affect it. Make sure my brush is clean, and it is. Okay, so I'm going to take some white here. I've got a little bit of white. I'm just going to take a small amount of blue. And I'm going to blend them together. If I'm in the classroom, I usually have the kids use a popsicle stick to blend. But since I don't have one handy, I'm just going to use my brush. Not my favorite mixing tool usually. Alright, so I'm making a stronger blue tint. And I'm not sure if I'm thrilled with that or not. I'm going to add a little more blue. So I'll clean off my brush a little bit. Take a little more of my blue, mix it in. Because I don't want it real dark. And one thing about acrylics is they tend to dry darker. Whereas in watercolor, they tend to dry a little bit lighter. Acrylics tend to dry darker once they finish curing. So I want to make sure I don't get it too dark, because I want enough contrast between the outline and the actual. Alright, I think that'll work. My white paint's a little bit clumpy. It's getting old. Alright. Clean enough. So I'm going to take my darker blue tint here. I think I want to make it even darker. It still looks too light. Because I'm thinking ahead, because whatever I go for next is going to be the skin color. And if they're too close to each other, then it doesn't look right. There's not much I can do to change it back. So, darken that up some more. Go ahead and pull a little more in here. Alright, I think that blue will work. And you want to make sure it's mixed up well, because the last thing you want is a bunch of streaks of darker colors and lighter color, you know, just it doesn't look right. So you make sure that you've got it blended well. Now I'm going to get in here and I'm going to paint in the iris, and you can paint around it, and then like I said, at this stage you can actually paint over, and it just makes it look a little weird because it looks like you're getting rid of his eye, but remember we're painting backwards, so everything is still showing on the opposite side, but this is filling in that iris right here. Okay, and then the pupil is already there, but I'm putting this in between the eyelids, just kind of filling it in. Looks strange from this side, obviously. And I'm going to fill in the lips, and our lips are usually darker value than our skin color, so that's why I'm using the same values that I had for the top. Okay. And so for that reason, you really don't need a whole lot of this, and actually I can paint right over that center line because it's already dry. So this is filling in those spaces. Looks a little strange. But now I've created a tint for the lips, and to finish the eyes, I'm going to rinse out my brush. Now if you wanted to use some of this darker tint in somewhere else, like perhaps the bow, which could actually be darker than that, I might even gray it down to do the bow, and that would require just a small amount of black. But right now I'm not going to concern myself with that. I could go up and do some of the hair, but we're going to try to keep the number of values that we're working with simple, because we don't want this project, I mean, you could get as detailed as you want and as many values as you want, but I'm trying to make this project a little quicker. Alright, so once you have this, the lips and the iris, you know, the rest of the eye filled in, then you can create the tint for the skin color. Alright, which means that it should be lighter than the lips. So, let's see. Looking over here, actually I do have a plastic spatula thing here for plastic palette knife. I'm going to add some more white into this and see if I can lighten it up. What I typically do is I take just a small amount of blue to a larger amount of white when I'm trying to do a skin color. And I think I'm going to need to do that right now. So that nearby, because you never know where you might want to use that, and that could become my, so I'm using tube paint. Like I said, it's a thicker consistency of acrylic from the Hobby Lobby store here. Okay, so now I'm going to take a little bit of my blue and I'm going to blend it in with some white. I try not to blend all of it. I try to keep some of my white because I might want to make another color with it or another tint. So I work in this spot, which is not easy because this paint, like I said, the white is getting old and it's not mixing well. There we go. Now this is super light. I'm not sure if I wanted that light, simply because I might want to do a light background. So I'm going to grab a little bit more blue. It just so happens the blue I'm using is not as dark as some of them. It's ultramarine blue. And it seems to have a transparent, a little more transparent. think I'm close to what I want. Trying to, again, get those streaks of color out of there. We're going to go with it. Alright, then I'll wipe that off on my paper towel at the side here. Let me brush aside for a minute. Alright. Okay. Now, I need a different brush because the brush I've been using is a detail brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to a small flat brush so that I can start brushing in skin color. So this will go a little faster. So I got my tint for the skin. It's lighter than the lips, so that's good. And all of this lines and things that I've done are dry, so I can actually start just lightly tapping in that paint or brushing it in. And when you start getting low, fill your brush up. Don't scrape it down because you don't want to pull off your previous paint, and you don't want what's going to happen if you keep pulling it really thin is you're going to have these brush strokes showing on the other side, and you'll have to put another layer through. So I'm just going to go ahead and cover this whole face so it looks like he's disappearing, but remember again, and I found a spot that didn't mix. I just saw a streak of blue there. Alright, we're trying to fill this in, and everything's dry underneath. So everything should stay intact. Just trying to fill in all of his skin color. Don't forget the ears. The kids, when we do this project in class, kids often forget to paint their ears. So fill in that space because that's also skin. Okay. And this ear, even though it's really dark, it's a very poor quality picture, but quality for that era. Alright. Keep going. And if you miss some things, it'll also, when you do your background, and make sure this is dry, because if you have paint that is wet, it's going to smear all over underneath here. So you got to be very careful that the areas you've already painted are dry, like the lips and the eyes, because otherwise you'll get this big streak of color running through the face. Might create an interesting effect, but not exactly what we want if we're doing a portrait. Alright, so I've worked my way down toward the beard. Then I just kind of grab up some more paint and look for areas that look like they might be a little bit thin. Because you'll notice them as you're painting. It's like, oh, that area I can kind of see through. So you just come back and put a little more paint there. Because you're trying not to have huge brush strokes. And your paint is always different. This paint is a little bit thicker bodied, so it tends to coat well the first time. It just depends on how much you've pulled it out. Like I say, quite often students will pull the paint right down to where it's almost completely thinned out and you can see through. And it's just simply because it's new to them and they haven't figured out how to pull the paint gently so that you're not taking all the paint off, but that you're carefully moving excess paint to areas that need more, that have less and need more. Alright, so I think we're doing fairly well. This ear doesn't seem to want to cover. Let me get this side here a little more, just a little ways into the hair. And I'm not too concerned about going any further. If I go further into it, it's not a huge issue. But we now have the facial area covered. Skin tint is in place. Alright? So then you have to think about the clothing down below. So you could do a tone of the color. So if we want to tone it down, we would add black and white both. So we could take what we've already used, such as this light, slightly darker blue here, tint, and we could add some black to it and use that on the bow tie like I'd mentioned before. see, which obviously the bow tie is not showing, so I'll have to adjust my camera, but the bow tie is down here. Alright, so I'm going to take a break for a moment and we'll come back. Okay, while that's drying a little bit, I was just going to do that quick reveal. If I pull it back, you can see the face is still there. We can see the iris color came out. We can still see where we use the dark blue, and there's that little bit of white for the sparkle. You can see where I allowed the paint to come out, but I did it really thin, so it's actually darkened up now that I've added that, because there were a lot of shadows in the original photo. So it's starting to turn out. It's looking pretty good. Alright, and I'm going to slide this up just a little higher, so let me use my tape that I had it. That way you can see what the bow tie I was referring to. It is in the picture right down here. Okay, so I think we're going to do a grayed down version just for that. And I might use regular white here again, so that's why I saved some white here on my tray. And that's simply just a lid from left over from the produce department. Something that came, fresh fruit or something. You can reuse plastic lids. It's pretty cool. And the nice thing about acrylic paint is when it dries, a lot of times you can peel this paint off of here. If there's anything left, it creates a little acrylic skin, and you can reuse it, the container. And some people even take the acrylic skins, put them on a canvas, and turn them into art. Again, so let me pull some of this white out of here, and I'm going to go ahead and paint his little bow tie, or not, it's not a bow tie, but above the bow tie here, his shirt. Alright, and it doesn't matter again if the beard is overlapping some of that and you hit over it with a little bit of the white, it's okay. Okay, again, you're going to want to make sure that you're getting a fairly even coat. I'm getting lots of streaks with this. Alright. Unless the brush marks don't bother you. Okay, let me go through here. And paint that in. I'm still painting between those lines that we created when we did our outline step. So the first steps are pretty easy. It's making the tints. It's a little tricky, but it's not hard. I mean, it's just, it takes a little more concentration and a little more effort. But it's all doable. Alright, so I think I've got this pretty well covered. Leave that, and I just realized, and I'm glad I saved a little skin color, even though it's a little bit darker, but it's very shadowed down here in the neckline. So I'm glad I still have some skin color because I need to paint that spot. I just noticed that I missed it. And I have a little bit of my skin blue that I made. And I already put a very thin layer of the other blue to shadow this area some. So it'll still look darker on the other side when I'm all done. Just filling in where the neck was showing. And that might not have been real visible on the camera. Alright, so we're going to leave that in there. And like I said, eventually we're going to cover this whole thing. Now as far as the bow tie, let's see if I can locate some black. I know I have. Just finding one that's open. There we go. I have some black. I'm just going to put just a small amount. And as you can see, I've had very little paint on here so far to do this. Sometimes it's a habit for some, especially kids, is to use a lot of paint because you don't realize that a little goes a long way. Especially since we're not building it up very much on here. Alright, so I've got black, probably more than I needed, but I can take a little bit of that. Remember, the black is very strong. And I'm going to use this darker blue that I had here, or the darker tint, and I'm going to mix that in, and it's going to give me a grayish, a bluish gray, just so that it's not the same as the skin color or the lip color. Okay, I'm trying to mix that up real well. That'll work. I shouldn't need too much. Okay, clean that off over here. Okay. Now I'm going to get my flat brush again. Made into this blue-gray that I just created, so a tone of the blue. And I'm going to paint in his bow tie. And again, you can cross over any lines that you created when you were outlining with blue, because they're dry and should still show through on the other side. Okay. So far, so good. And you kind of have to estimate how much paint you need for a space. And so far, everything's working out just right. Okay. Alright, so I've covered all that up. I have to let that dry. Wash out my brush again, because remember, we don't want to ruin our good brushes with acrylic paint. It dries like glue. Brushes become very, very unusable if they are left with too much, or left too long with the acrylic paint on them. Alright. So, let's see what happens when I just flip this and reveal, oh look, there's his face, his collar, and of course the bow tie is showing, so everything's working out just fine so far. The neck came out okay. Alright, so not bad. Now I have to figure out what I want to do for his jacket. And I'm thinking I'll probably do, I could do blue with a little bit of white, so it's even darker tint, or we could take this gray color and add more blue to it. Let's try that first. Let's take the gray and the blue and blend the two. Let's see what I get. Alright, so I made a darker version of the blue-gray here for the jacket. Could you have something darker? Sure. I also took some black and just went along my blue lines again to darken those up to make sure that they didn't get lost when I switch it around and use that darker color. Now, could I have gone darker? I mentioned yes, you could. I mean, that's just something you have to decide as the artist. Do you want it to be exact? Or you can play around with it a little bit. Sometimes when we're doing a reverse portrait, it's the detail in a piece of clothing is too complicated, so we turn it into just a simple plain piece of clothing or a t-shirt kind of thing. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and paint that and then let that dry. Painted in the jacket in all of these areas around it, and I even took some of the jacket color and started filling in so it would fill in some of the gaps in the beard, and I'm going to continue that. And then this will have to dry before we can actually do the background paint, which would usually go lighter, so even lighter than the facial blue, almost white. So we have to let this dry, and I'm going to go ahead and finish some of the hair, add some of this color up in there, then I'll let it dry. For this next step, you want to make sure you put some newspaper down on your surface, because we're going to be covering the rest of the background with acrylic paint, and quite often it goes off the sides and kind of makes a mess. One of the things that you will want to do right now is try to remove the tape from your plastic. Sometimes it comes off well, sometimes it doesn't. Let me show you what we have so far. Okay, so it has turned out well. We've got all the results, and if you look here at the bottom, one of the things I like to do when I'm not going to complete something, continue on the picture, I just kind of rough up the edges. So it looks like it's not going to be finished at that end. Alright, and we've got our paper down. It looks like I still have some wet paint back here because I just saw it stick to the page. So I have to let this dry some more. And while I'm doing that, I notice I still have, I'm going to try to get this tape off of here. But the reason I keep it real thin at the top is just in case I can't get it off. That typically can be hidden in a frame. Because this is 8.5 by 11 plastic and will fit in a document frame. Alright, well, we're going to let this dry some more, and then we'll paint the background. Alright, so we're ready to do the final, and I've got the colors ready to put on the background. So we just have to mix them together. And one of the things I like to do is I know that I want it very light because I want enough contrast between this, so I use a lot of white, and I'll just take a small amount of the blue and mix them together and see how that is. I mean, we're going for barely tinted here, and I'm hoping I didn't pull too much blue in as I mix, but it takes a while. It's like, gotta resist the temptation to keep pulling color in because it looks like it's not changing. It takes quite a bit of stirring, and like I said, this white is getting older, so it's very resistant to being mixed right now, but it is working. Just trying to get it smooth, and if you may not have noticed the change, but this is very, very, very lightly tinted, and that's what I'm going to go with. Just a very light tint of blue. So it's mostly white, just a tiny bit of blue, and I'm trying to get it all mixed in, and I'm still seeing some streaks of darker blue underneath here. Okay. Once I get that all mixed up, I want to use a flat brush again, but I want to use one that's larger. So I'm going to set my paint to the side. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to wipe off my palette knife. I have that mess to deal with. Set my paper towel there, and grab another flat brush. This one's a little bit wider, so that I can get this background done fairly quick and in a smoother fashion. Now, if you're concerned and you don't have a lot of paint to work with, and you're concerned you're going to run out, one of the things you could do is just paint right up and just barely overlap the edges and make sure that you get all the clear areas covered. And if that's all you have, that's great. You can stop there. If you have enough, go ahead and cover the whole thing, because this will fill in any gaps that you might have missed before when you were painting in the various tints and shades. Alright, so put some paint on here. And this is again where you need to make sure that you're using your paint fairly liberal. And be careful not to slide your plastic back and forth, because it'll start getting paint on the underside of the plastic, which could be a pain. It can be cleaned off, but it's just not on the list of things that I want to do after I'm done. Rubbing alcohol, stuff you have in your medicine cabinet, works well to help loosen it up. So you have to make sure you don't get it on the back where the paint is exactly what you want it to be. Okay. So here I am, filling those spaces in, and this paint is very thick and goopy. So I'm going to continue painting that over, and when we're done, this whole thing will be covered. And like I said, you can go on the edges if you're worried about running out of paint, or you just want to be safe and do that first. Go for it. The main thing is you get your background painted. And once this is dry, I will show you what it looks like when we're done. So continue painting until your background is covered.